So that said, thank you so much that you could make time to join this timely conversation today on Africa's position in global AI governance. Really, what is our position in some of the key AI governance debates and conversations that are currently ongoing? As we've seen, AI is rapidly reshaping the lived experiences of millions across the globe and, of course, across Africa. And we're seeing how it's transforming key industries from redefining sovereignty, concentrating power in ways that demand agent governance responses. Across the continent, we've seen a growing number of national AI strategies that really signal a recognition that Africa must position itself as an architect of governance frameworks that center local realities. So we've really seen such a big push on this and on centering local realities and the local context. As global AI governance debates intensify, spanning efforts from the United Nations, for example, the Global Digital Compact, and the just ended Global Dialogue on AI Governance. And of course, we've also seen efforts from the African Union, especially with the Continental AI Strategy, and other new multilateral standard setting processes. What we see really from all these developments is that collectively they offer important signals of why African agency in the global AI governance debates is crucial. And it's really a question of where does Africa sit within these conversations and how can we shape a technological order that serves African interests equitably. So to unpack this, I have with me an interesting lineup of speakers. Excuse me, an interesting lineup of speakers that will help us to really examine how African voices are engaging, contesting, and seeking to reshape the global AI governance landscape. And the objective really today of our discussion is to highlight Africa's distinct approaches and positions on key global AI governance debates and conversations, and to provide a platform for exploring how advocates such as ourselves and practitioners within this ecosystem can assert greater influence within these processes. So that said, I will soon introduce my speakers or give them an opportunity to introduce themselves. But for those that have joined us, please, we are recording this webinar. So if you would like to stay off camera, we do understand, but also please do use a pseudonym. And for the rest of us, please feel free to introduce yourself within the chat section. And so to start us off today, we have an opening statement, and I'll call upon our next speaker shortly. But we know that the Global Dialogue on AI Governance recently concluded, so we really just want to reflect on that process to really see what are some of the takeaways for us for the African continent, and what are some of the key actions that we can take forward. And so to help us get into this conversation, I now invite Liz Orembo from Research ICT Africa. Liz, feel free to introduce yourself as you begin. But really, yes, I know that you were at the Global Dialogue on AI Governance and engaged quite actively. And I'm sure others on the call may have also been at that event. So please also do share your reflections within the chat. But Liz, really what we want to hear this afternoon is, what are some of the reflections that you have coming from that event? And really, what were, the key discussions? What's their relevance to the African region? But what are some of the key trends and takeaways or action items that we can take forward as African stakeholders working within this ecosystem? Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Bulanda. Yes, I was at the AI dialogue as some of us here. I was keen on how the UN was going to coordinate all stakeholders globally to look at the challenges as well as opportunities that we have in AI development, AI being an emerging technology, also feeding from other existing technology like data, AI, Internet of Things, and other kinds of technologies, which already have policy processes there. So, starting with the problem, There is that we have an emerging technology, which is AI, which poses great benefits and also harms, but the regulation and policy is fragmented, and because of that, so much risks there. And UN came up as a body that could convene most stakeholders, given that AI is being seen as a competitive advantage and so countries are tackling it from a competitive view and not really bringing people together. So that is a lot of risk where also Global South are exposed to more harms, plus also they don't get the opportunity to develop AI because it's concentrated in a few countries. So was the UN able to do this? That would be my first question, and I would say yes. And you look at the structure of the dialogue, and then you start asking questions on how civil society would have participated better, or how did civil society participate in the first place. So it started with a lot of consultations ahead of the dialogue itself, and there was a lot of interest. Like in a single call, speakers would be 1,200 wanting to give input into the process. And you could see that the secretariat was so thin, and so there were no mechanisms to even give stakeholders feedback on what happened with their feedback, what was prioritized, what was not prioritized. So we start seeing those kinds of constraints there. In the dialogue, the structure of the dialogue itself, we have one work stream that is the scientific panel, which is supposed to give a report, and then that report feeds into the dialogue. One challenge there is that this report arrived just some hours or some days to the dialogue when the agenda had been set and everything. So people, yes, discussed the dialogue, but were they prepared, the report, but were they prepared to discuss it, and in what structures? Because the themes and the clusters had already been set with the dialogue. So that confusion of structure also makes it challenging for non-state actors or even state actors to participate really. Coming to the structure of it, the participation, there was a lot of priority given to state actors, which is okay. The structure of the dialogue is a multilateral process, bringing in other stakeholders, and then you have the scientific panel. But then it's not a clear civil society or non-state actor participation like others, like we've seen in WISES. If more effective way of participating is participating through your government, because they are given more prominence in their participation. Issues of participation. There were a lot of competing agendas, even within the thematic structure, the already clusters that were there. And we saw that a lot of Global South inputs were on equality of AI, equal opportunity of AI, having capacity to develop AI just like the other countries. And when you look, and it came across the theme as well. When you look at the safety discussions as well, the report, as well as the statements from countries and also from civil society, was that if we don't deploy AI and we don't have the large language models, then we don't have evidence on what harms are there in African countries. There were themes on data sovereignty. Also, if you don't have this AI deployment in the country, then in the countries and in the regions, then you also don't have sovereignty. And it is true that no country can achieve, there are arguments that no country can achieve full sovereignty. And so someone came up with a thing called managed dependency. But Global South don't have that agency to have that managed dependency going with the data sovereignty and the concessions we've been given in exchange for funding or certain types of technology. So capacity, I think I said that, and then there's AI and development coming in also as a theme within the inputs that were given by the Global South. So something like the way we were doing YC's ICT for development, can you also have AI for development where UN also tracks all other development sectors, whatever UN agency is involved. And then I think I mentioned the safety agenda, where there are global AI safety institutes. We don't have safety institutes in Africa. We only have one membership. And the investment to the safety institutes is by the government. But then there's also another crucial element where the big companies, the likes of OpenAI, Claude, they volunteer to give their models for evaluation. And if we don't have those, and also those political power, not really power, or just someone volunteering to give their models for evaluation, then we'll not be able to evaluate safety there. I mentioned capacity building, and I'd also like to mention G70. Is it G77 and China? I usually confuse on the numbers. So they also had a statement there, and they were calling for AI and development agenda. And this is very, very interesting because after the Shanghai conference on AI, they formed an AI corporation looking at AI and development. My thing that I would like to take from this conference is that the structure of inputs is very thin, and even how countries are going to follow up on them is going to be very thin, even going into the New York session. So a lot of work and a lot of cooperation is going to happen in between the sessions, between Geneva and New York, and also rotating back. And I see, I look at the Chinese and the G77 countries as a good avenue to do this background work, so that when we go into a New York session, we see already some work has been done, and some of the positions that the Global South were putting forward, someone has begun to work on it and has more evidence and solution on how to move forward. And that kind of thing should be replicated across very many things, be it safety and children, be it sovereignty, be it capacity building or AI and development. One challenge with that, please remind me if I'm beyond my time. One challenge is that the the AI cooperation, it follows strictly a multilateral kind of structure, and it's very, very difficult for civil society to participate there. The secretariat, I think BRICS is going to participate in it as a member. So that's up to us to contact our BRIC member South Africans to see how we're going to participate. The other entity or institution that's going to participate there, I think, is the African Union. So those are the only two spaces that you can start knowing, where we can start knowing how to participate in the WICO initiative. Otherwise, it still remains so much of a multilateral and closed initiative. Yeah, so I think what I can give as a parting shot, one thing that I just, if I am to repeat, is that the structure of inputs itself was very limiting. I felt that it was very, very thin, given that we had 3 forums going on at the same time: YCIS, the UN dialogue, and the AI for Good. But even if you wanted to participate at the AI dialogue full time, you'd still get very limited spaces to participate because there's a lot. It's not like the IGF where you there's call for a session, and then you gather your stakeholders, and then you say what you've been doing and collaborate there. It's more of an audience, high level and audience structure. And when you're given time to participate, you're just given 3 minutes at the podium, and you can only say much. So a lot of the work, I guess, is going to be done at the background, so that when we go to the New York session, people are more. There's a lot of background work, and you're more prepared, and there's a lot of value of coalescing as coalitions and coming together with stronger positions instead of doing it individually. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liz, for that overview. I mean, it's clear to see what the deliberations were about. So really interesting to see that some of the things that we've continuously perhaps discussed and talked about keep coming up, right? Especially around it being a very multilateral process and some of the constraints that especially us as civil society have in terms of participation and of course engaging with such structures. But really food for thought for the rest of us in terms of thinking about how do we, besides all these dynamics, how do we ensure that we are structuring our inputs better, coordinating better, with various stakeholders that Liz has mentioned, be it some of the BRICS countries, be it at the AU level, perhaps even coordinating with some of our states that may be very active within these processes. So really food for thought, and it's something that we hope that we can unpack even as we get ahead with this conversation. With that, it's just a huge thank you, Liz. Please hang around. Would like to still have you on the call in case there are any questions, but of course, in case you have any further input. So we'll now be getting into our panel discussion for the day. And to help me unpack some of the issues today, I have Towekile Matimbe from Paradigm Initiative, Elizabeth Onyango from the Thomson Reuters Foundation, and Lydia Taban from Masakane Languages Hub. And of course, they will give a more detailed introduction once we get into the discussion. But really this afternoon, we want to really unpack what are some of our positions on some of the key global AI governance issues and debates that have been emerging. And for today, of course, we'll be looking at the issue of sovereignty. I think it's something that also Liz did mention, that, you can't have total sovereignty as a country, but how do we navigate that? So really, how are we ensuring that we're addressing the sovereignty question within the governance debates? But also how are we balancing development imperatives and within the governance frameworks, and of course inclusion and safety. And Liz did allude to that. We need to invest more around the safety agenda. So with that said, I'll start off with you, Elizabeth. So we're increasingly seeing governments worldwide moving towards regulating AI. We're seeing similar efforts in Africa, and of course, a lot of narratives pointing to local first, homegrown governance solutions, and sometimes pushing for digital sovereignty. So in the spirit of democratizing AI governance, what does meaningful self-governance look like in practice for the African continent? Over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Belinda, and greetings to my namesake and, of course, everybody else. So TRF, maybe I can just give a sentence as to what we do. I am the head of the Africa Hub of Thomson Reuters Foundation, which is essentially a global nonprofit organization working to foster free, fair, and informed societies through a combination of media, legal, and data intelligence initiatives. We need to advance democratic resilience, institutional integrity, and social cohesion. We work with the media. AI, of course, cuts across all our pillars: information integrity, access to law, and responsible business. And I'm going to provide some strokes as I answer your question, just broad strokes based on some of the work we've been doing, especially within our access to law pillar. So maybe first I'll start by saying, local first and homegrown governance, is critical for digital sovereignty. It's only a part of the solution without the meaningful democratic agency over rules, data, infrastructure, markets, and accountability systems that shape AI on the continent. Then there's a big risk of simply passing on some of the same concerns at the sort of wider global level locally with apparently different face. One of the researches that we conducted together with Article 19 on the impact of AI on freedom of expression in Eastern and Southern Africa across 8 countries found, unsurprisingly, that across these countries, AI tools are primarily adopted for economic purposes, and I think Liz alluded to something like that as well. And there was a significant information gap on how these tools infringe on rights. So most countries in developing their frameworks are focusing on developmental and economic benefits at the expense of, focus on securing adequate human rights safeguards. So, and, generally there's a framing of AI not as not artificial, not intelligent, but essentially a registry of power. Something that we have, quickly come to understand in the African region, that it comes down to who designs, procures, controls all these systems, who audits and who bears responsibility for harms. And we know it's market-driven and what appears to be a narrow market. So what does meaningful self-regulation look like? I think, first, African states need to prioritize or look to prioritizing a coherent and clear framework that reflects local realities, whether it's languages, labor markets, civic space, even media and information ecosystems, informal economies. It needs to reflect these realities, oral traditions, high informality, low connectivity. It's also important to ground it in the reality that we stand on the foundation of infrastructure, systems, and platforms and tools that largely come from out of the continent. And in them are baked long-running biases and exclusions. So, we're looking at regulation. Ideally, meaningful self-regulation would include, thinking towards more deliberate steps to how to shifting from adoption to creating, co-creating policies that support the funding of, I said creation of adoption, but also encourage the building of strong open source solutions, and bridge that education, the digital divide, especially with information and education. So we're not only a consumer or subject, but can actively and meaningfully participate. We lack open source first procurement policies. So a lot of contracts obviously are going outside. Procurement contracts should also require technology transfer, local capacity building, actively preference locally built digital public good solutions where they exist. You see, Africa contributes to 2 to 4% of all the certified digital public goods that support public service delivery on the continent. So only 2 to 4% is what we contribute. The rest comes from the West and some from China. And as we know, we also hold under 1% of global data center capacity, whereas we have 20% of the population. So just in terms of the inequality and where we're coming from, when we're looking at self-regulation and democratizing it, these are things we need to have in mind. We need to think this way, not just from narrow lens. Meaningful self-governance also means that African states and societies are not only simply tick boxing these AI strategies and policies, but are able to shape AI governance through public participation. And from Liz's example, it's not an easy thing to do, but it can be more effectively done. So it is inclusive, human rights safeguards, independent oversight, locally relevant data governance, and accountability for both state and corporate actors. There should be an emphasis on democratic control and public interest governance, and not simply on moving from dependence say on foreign companies, to potentially unchecked state power. These rules must also be democratically developed, said the meaningful participation, civil society, media, technical communities, companies, affected communities, everyone as involved as possible. And participation is not just at one stage, it's throughout the whole process, from before deployment, if possible. I know sometimes not always practical, but it really should be something that is all the way through, including having effective redress. Also in terms of some of the research we're doing, we found that regulatory frameworks need to be coherent and provide a more comprehensive response. The fragmented approach is what we have. So we are developing these strategies, policies that also rely on a patchwork of general ICT, cybercrime, data protection, and media laws, which is, one way of doing it. But what happens is there are lots of gaps in between, and we tend to lack clear remedies, especially for AI-related harms. I'll also add, before I stop, that also the strategy in terms of a framework and a regulatory framework, the strategies and even data protection laws should really come with explicit and direct human rights safeguards or mechanisms for corporate accountability. So at TRF, we have what is known as an AI Company Disclosure Initiative. It's aiming to really enhance transparency and promote responsible AI by providing sort of a structured view of how companies adopt and govern AI through voluntary disclosure. So through some of this research, we found that even for what are known as governance mature companies, those that have a strategy board oversight, they're making an attempt to be responsible and transparent on how they use and effective on how they use AI. Even with those, their human rights and ethical impact assessment remains weak. So this really needs to be brought into this whole wider ecosystem. And of course, governance should also be enforceable through impact assessments, independent oversight, transparency obligations, effective remedies for harm, and clear accountability, not just for companies, governments, but also definitely companies as well. So sovereignty overall is really centering people and institutions to have meaningful power to be able to shape and question, challenge, and benefit from AI systems.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And of course, even ourselves at Digital Action share the same sentiments, especially around sovereignty, in that it should center the people. And of course, my takeaway from what you've shared is that as a continent, we need to be moving more from adoption to co-creation, and really ensuring or fostering more African agency. So throughout the entire process, whether it's looking at the frameworks, the infrastructure, looking at data governance, so really just ensuring democratic control, public interest, and of course the right safeguards are in place. And of course, addressing some of the fragmentation in efforts that we currently see. And now moving over to you, Tobekile, Elizabeth mentioned something really interesting, which is that a lot of our AI governance efforts currently point to the economic benefits, right? They seem to be centered a lot around the development imperatives. And of course, as we know, governments often face pressure to move fast on AI adoption, often, citing, economic growth, while governance frameworks often urge caution and safeguards. How should African policymakers think about sequencing regulation against, excuse me, how should we be thinking about sequencing regulation against innovation? And of course, reflecting on some of the work that we're doing at Paradigm Initiative with the Life project, really, I don't know, how do you see things as Paradigm Initiative and as an organization that is fostering digital inclusion?
Thank you so much, Belanda. And my name is Tobegile Matimbe, as already mentioned, and I work for Paradigm Initiative, which is an organization that's working across the African continent, promoting digital rights and digital inclusion. And I work for that organization as Senior Manager for Partnerships and Engagements. And part of my work involves engaging in various global processes, including the UN-AI dialogue that Liz mentioned. And I'll start from that specific dialogue as I unpack development vis-a-vis innovation and also ensuring that relevant safeguards are put in place. So so this year also we did participate in the UN AI dialogue, the inaugural dialogue. And our expectations going to that platform were to see some of the challenges we are seeing on the African continent being spotlighted, and not just that, it was also an expectation to hear our own African governments speaking to what they would hope to do to ensure that some of the harms that we see arising out of AI deployment are mitigated or totally addressed if possible. But unfortunately, the spirit of that entire AI dialogue, what we saw was such a hyping up of AI as AI for development, which is what you primarily mentioned. And I'll post in a chat one of the contributions that we made to a civil society sort of shadow report that we submitted to the co-chairs of that AI dialogue, together with other coalitions, where we were articulating some of our critical concerns, especially for the global south. So back to the conversation on development, I think one of the key things that we definitely cannot run away from is that definitely AI does have its benefits, but those benefits are not worth the risks that we face, especially without adequate measures to ensure that we tackle harms. Obviously, an appreciation of the fact that there are serious power asymmetries in the context of AI governance, in the context of AI development, is a good starting point for our governments, especially in the rush you mentioned, Bulanda, towards coming up with AI national strategies. We are seeing that governments, of course, we would love to see measures being put in place, but we are more concerned as Paradigm Initiative to see governments rushing through the process of coming up with these strategies, avoiding the conversation of international human rights law, which is very critical to bridging the harmful things that come out of deployment of AI tools and systems. We are also cognizant of the fact that our governments, I think from their perspective, they're thinking, of course, healthcare, they're thinking agriculture, they're thinking education. And to that end, they're posturing AI as bringing in, or that magic wand that is going to transform the entire continent and transform communities. But forgetting the one critical thing about the digital divide, which exists on the continent before we even interrogate the AI divide. So you find that most of our strategies will talk about, pillars or objectives that they're trying to tackle. And those objectives talk about development, among other things. And then you see a cursory inclusion of the term connectivity, of which connectivity on its own does not suffice, because you can connect those who are digitally excluded, and then how do they get to be online once you've connected them potentially through digital public infrastructure? Let's not talk about just that. What about the ability to use devices and use them responsibly? Because again, that's one of the primary concerns when digital rights actors are, calling for digital rights. Governments seem to say you are avoiding the issue, for instance, of information integrity. No, we are not excluding it. We are simply saying, while we are having rollout of technology, are you ensuring that people have the capacity to use those technologies, which is digital literacy? And that's where our programming comes into play. For instance, the life legacy programming that we run at Paradigm Initiative, where we go into communities and train them on using tools, digital literacy, capacity building, so that people are able to actually meaningfully use technology and responsibly use technology. So it's contextual. Development for who is the question that we ask. it has to be development even for the underserved communities, those in the rural areas. And largely when you look at our African communities, you find that the digital divide is a lived reality. Most of our communities are not online. Most of our communities do not have access to digital devices. And more so, we see also the intersectionalities coming to play, where we see that even when we're looking at women, we look at women with disabilities, we look at all these groups that are left behind in the context of AI adoption. So you find that the race to come up with, strategies on its own, and we are posturing it as a development tool. For who is still the question that I mean remains in my mind, and this is a critical conversation that we're hoping to have seen even being much more unpacked within the context of the UN AI dialogue. Not just that as well, we saw specific groups excluded, and this was also something that was raised by the co-facilitators of the UN AI dialogue, that women and indigenous groups were underrepresented in that platform. And you look at it from a perspective of funding, resources. How do you have meaningful participation of global South actors in such fora where AI governance is discussed at a global level with our African representatives there, and going back home and not saying a word about what they discussed or they had, and they crack on as business as usual? So I think one of the key things we could do even as a community is to ensure that we are able to follow through those processes at global level, and also be able to track it down to national level to ensure that on the continent we are calling our accountability mechanisms to account, as they are accountability mechanisms. Those are our governments, to tell us in the context of this development. I mean, what about those people who are going to be left behind? What are the critical strategies to ensure that we bridge the digital divide? Power asymmetries are so real. And once we talk about AI adoption itself beyond just regulation, we should also be able to think about how AI fits into our historical context, into our social context, into even our political context. Because ultimately, when we talk about procurement issues, I think, which were mentioned as well by Liz, you'll see that the concerns for human rights defenders, for civil society actors remain real, because we are seeing governments so excited for this development, but using AI systems for surveillance, among other things, which is particularly concerning. So basically, innovation is great. We want to see it on the continent, but we do not want innovation at the expense of human rights, where we see people being left behind. We still want to see international human rights law featured even in the priorities of governments when they come up with these mechanisms or strategies, among others.
Thank you so much, Tobekile. Really do agree with the sentiments. And of course, thanks for sharing some of those reflections, having participated in some of the processes around the dialogue on AI governance, as well as WSIS and the others. Again, really interesting to see, and you reaffirming this notion that there's this, hyping of AI for development without really critically looking at the envisioned risks. And of course, that we need to be paying attention to some of the underlying issues around the digital divide, AI-enabled surveillance, and so on and so forth. But more importantly, really paying attention to development for who. And we will touch upon that shortly with our next speaker. So Lydia, over to you. So many AI safety frameworks are designed around language, context, and risk profiles that don't often reflect African realities. What does inclusion require at the technical and governance level for AI systems to be truly safe for African users?
Thank you so much for having me here, Bulanda. I'm really, really glad to be a part of this conversation. My name is Lydia Taban. I am the community manager at Masakane. Masakane is a collective that came from research work happening to enable the inclusion of African languages in technology through natural language processing research, creation of data sets, as well as integration of models. So I'm just going to talk a bit about safety in the And I'm going to pull at a few public examples that we have about safety. When we think about AI and its accessibility to people, often the safety frameworks in which it's built upon focus on languages that aren't our languages. And even when they have these safety benchmarks within Western languages, they tend to fail. Case in point is a situation where OpenAI compelled a young, impressionable teenager to go ahead and commit suicide on account of the conversation that they were having. So when we think about AI and how broadly it's used, we then need to think about AI and its applicability within the African context. So when we think about inclusion, inclusion should be premised on safety. And when we think about safety, we need to think about what safety looks like in Zulu, in Hausa, in Kiswahili when people utilize AI. We are still at a point where quite a number of our languages are excluded. Broad platforms that are utilized that integrate AI are not able to recognize our languages. And sometimes this comes at great cost. We're not able to more effectively police language. We're not able to more effectively monitor situations of hate speech, for instance. And so this very much ends up existing as a gap because safety as it's built in AI is premised on Western taxonomies. It's premised on thinking and a belief system that is upheld by the big companies in Silicon Valley. And so the consequences that end up manifesting for us are we have misclassified speech, we have weaker guardrails, and models that are easier to break or to manipulate. And so as we think about this, inclusion is a core part of us being able to solve this, not inclusion simply in terms of how we say it or the belief that we can include more, but actually building and genuinely building AI that is reflective of African languages. And so when we think about what this kind of inclusion requires, first, it requires data. Africa has more than 2,000 spoken languages, majority of which are not digitally mapped. It's very difficult today, for example, to find an app that allows you to purchase something using e-commerce with the Skuma language that is spoken in Tanzania. And for us to be able to solve that, we need to be able to build foundational data sets. And so data is the beginning. Community created, consented, and culturally grounded data sets. And when I say culturally grounded, it's important to note that even as you're collecting data, context is valid. Context is very, very important. I think a good example to use is when you use a basic LLM model out there and you tell it, this is an airway surgeon carrying out a surgery, it doesn't read it as airway because it doesn't understand African context. It reads it as ewe, like a sheep, for example. And so that's important. As we're collecting this data, it needs to be contextually relevant and it needs to be done in a way that upholds care. The next thing that inclusion requires is evaluation. We need to be cognizant of the fact that these models are already out there and existing in the world. And quite a number of them are the ones that won the AI race and are now used by many people. And so it's important for us as Africans to hold that to account and evaluate these existing models and point out the ways in which they are inadequate and they fail and how they need to be improved for them to truly be an expression of a global technology. And finally, modality. When we think about inclusion, when it comes to modalities pertaining to data, it's really hard for many people who are the builders of AI to contemplate that many of our languages are verbally spoken, they're oral languages, and they're not necessarily written down. And so that becomes an additional context to think about when it comes to AI and building AI with care. I'll get into this a little bit later, what Masakane is doing and how we can all work together to improve the view on this. And so I'll talk a bit now about governance aspects as regards inclusion, just building up on what Thubekile was talking about right now, holding governance to account. So African participation in the AI conversation needs to not just be us taking on what's given to us, but actively being a part of that conversation and defining what harm looks like from AI in the African context. Another aspect that's very key is contemplating data sovereignty. We are at a point where AI requires a lot of data for it to incrementally improve, for it to incrementally reach other people. And for them to be able to do that more effectively and to fine tune these models, they require data. And some of that data may come from Africa. So we need to ask questions about ethics. Is this data being collected in an ethical way? Is this data being collected in a way that creates value for the communities from whom it's being collected from? Are we doing our best to minimize the extractive practices that could affect us when we think about inclusion in AI? And finally, resourcing. It's not enough to advocate and speak about it, but it's also very important to be a part of building. A lot of AI as it exists right now is, and as most people are aware of it, is premised on large language models. And large language models are very resource intensive. They require a lot of power, they require a lot of cooling, they require much to run. But in the African context, within Masakania, we have innovators who think about how to build AI in a way that is more mindful. Small language models and how we can connect them to other small language models in different African contexts using neural nets, so that we are still able to have AI that is reflective of us, but is also fair to the planet. And so for us to be able to ensure these innovations come to light and are able to scale to a point where they create meaningful impact, not just on the continent, but globally, we require resourcing. The unfortunate truth is, as Elizabeth said before, quite a bit of this resourcing is not home-based. It's very much influenced by the global context. And so this is something we need to think about more as Africans. What are the steps we can take to better resource our own technological inclusion and being a part of that global conversation in a place where we are owners of our data, owners of our technological future.
Thank you so much, Lydia. Really interesting insights. And of course, what I get is that interpretation of safety is diverse and that taxonomy matters. So for the AI systems to be able to communicate effectively with some of the safety protocols, they need to align on the language. And thank you so much for taking us through what inclusion looks like, both from the technical and governance perspective. And it's really interesting that you mentioned ethics. And if we could build upon that shortly. But also just to invite everyone on the call, if you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the chat. We'll be opening up very soon for a round of reflection. So please do share your thoughts. But staying with you, Lydia, you mentioned ethics. What are some of the concrete safeguards, beyond principles on paper that are needed to protect marginalized and vulnerable groups from AI-enabled harm? You did touch upon some of the harms. So especially in contexts when enforcement capacity is quite weak. So where frameworks don't exist or enforcement capacity is quite weak, how do we ensure that we're protecting marginalized and vulnerable groups from these AI-enabled harms?
Thank you for that. So I think a very key part is what Tobikile mentioned as regards to digital literacy. It's very important that we give the opportunity for awareness to communities about the value that exists in their communities, even in this new technological age. For quite a number of communities that haven't been connected or are newly connected to the internet, this might not be self-evident. And so sometimes a company from Silicon Valley will show up and collect data, and they will not have clarity on what this data is being collected for, how it's going to be used, and other aspects around that. So one of the things that we can do that's very, very key, and I think it's something that has to keep happening incrementally, is digital literacy. Helping people be aware that the digital cultural artifacts have great value. Additionally, something else to think about is licensing. when we think about how traditionally licensing has been done for most versions of data that exist on the open internet, we end up thinking about open licensing. And often open licensing will give you attribution, perhaps a mention when your data is used, but you're not able to really extract additional value from that. And so this is a question we've asked often in the NLP ecosystem. How can we ensure that even as the big players, the OpenAIs, etc., are able to use and consume these models, that value, be it monetary, be it attribution, ultimately comes back to the community. And so we now have community-based licensing, which essentially means people of a community speaking a language have ownership of that language in perpetuity. And it's a multi-tiered license, which says that, for example, in the African context and for academic purposes, they can use that for free as long as they go with attribution. However, in scenarios where that data is being capitalized upon for monetary gain, that has to trickle down to the community before it can ultimately be used for that. There has to be an agreement that enables for that to happen. I will say that the structure exists, which is great, but then enforcement becomes a challenge because we're still in a scenario where quite a number of governmental entities on the continent are they're not nearly as well versed on what AI could be as they should. And so this also becomes a question of governance. The people whom are in charge, can they learn more about AI? Can they internalize what the potential value that exists in African data is in AI, and how can they ensure that that value comes back to Africans? And so that I think also touches on continental frameworks. So it's great that these conversations are happening at the AU level, but I feel like they are just that at this point, conversations, and more needs to be done to ensure that ultimately the words meet the action. And ultimately, Africa's technology future is safe from exploitation by outside actors.
Thank you so much, Lydia. Indeed, more needs to be done, but good to see that there are some practical things that even civil society could take a lead on, like you mentioned, digital literacy, but also fostering licensing. And of course, enforcement still remains a challenge, lots of governance constraints that we see across the board. Now, coming back to you, Elizabeth, earlier we spoke about what meaningful self-governance would look like in practice. And as we conclude, are there like 2 to 3 things that states should be prioritizing in fostering democratized AI?
Thank you. And I think quite a few things have been mentioned, but maybe if I think about it that way, one that I will underscore again is that public participation element, because that's how all these ideas also get fed in. And it needs to be something continuous throughout the process. Having a regulation that clearly has public participation embedded in it and as a requirement and a reminder. And I know nowadays it's a term that's used a lot, and there are different ways public participation is mentioned, used, or tick boxed. But I think something we really need to emphasize on and ensuring that it is representative. Meaningful public participation involves including affected communities. And when you look at AI, who are affected communities is every single person by the scale it's reached. But I think in this case, it's important to ensure to look at different groups, marginalized, underserved, remote, ensure you have diverse representation, women, disabled, rural, urban, young, older, everyone. And I think this is where the role of civil society really comes in, and to understand to make sure to integrate the role of civil society organizations and community-based organizations to help with this. But I think if public participation is there, and I'll put digital, if I can throw digital literacy in there as well, because you cannot really have that meaningful participation if you do not also along the side have digital literacy. So along with everybody else, it's an area I will underscore. And then just policies that also support, are mindful, encourage, promote this local and indigenous creation as well, and start thinking towards having that legitimate ownership and agency all the way at all systems, as we talked about. So funding, awareness, open source software, and everything else that we've been talking about. And as Lydia said, how do we also do this mindfully? That serves our purposes of the communities, everyone, but also environmentally, is mindful and is responsible. I'd say many more, but I can stop there for now. An impact assessment, maybe I'll say
The three
that's
also
essential.
suffice. Thank you so much. Plus impact assessment. Thank you so much for sharing that. Clearly, we can see that digital literacy seems to be coming out as a common thread. But of course, for a lot of us on the call, I guess it's a call to action. I think public participation also has come up quite a lot. And really within this conversation, we can already identify where we could play a greater role. That said, Tobekile, coming back to you, I know we've spoken quite a lot about like the global dialogue on AI governance and the WSIS process and so on and so forth. And I know that you did issue a shadow report. We've spoken a lot about where the processes fell short in addressing some of the concerns that we have as a continent. But really to flip the coin, it's just to say, is there one or two things that this dialogue achieved? What, in terms of addressing some of our concerns and priorities? Is there something that we can point to as a bit of a success, maybe?
Yes, it's always good to try and reflect on that and see the rays of light, right? The fact that obviously we were able to converge, and I think this is something that the UN was able to pull together. Like I mentioned, this was an inaugural AI dialogue. It was a good starting point. Yeah, I struggled to make a blanket. It was a good approach without also sort of, because I still feel the shadow of the gaps and challenges. But to be honest, it was a start. I think one of the key concerns that Liz mentioned was that there were multiple events happening at the same time. Like there was WUSIS, and then there was this one about AI being good or AI for good. And then you also had the UNAI dialogue. So it kind of felt like attention was kind of split across these three sort of, engagements. But the idea, I think one of the rationales for that was to try and ensure that at least there's participation from a perspective of resources and ensuring that these things happen at the same time. So I think there was that level of consideration around the funding to enable different stakeholders to be in the room. I think one of the key things that came out as well was that kind of, ability to engage with the facilitators of the process, to also be able to test the barometer of where are governments, where are they in terms of this conversation, because we're anticipating the next one as well next year. And different consultations will still be run, which the community here can follow and track through virtual calls and submissions. So it was a good launchpad of that mandate, but also being able to contribute. Of course, the downside is that there was no resolution from the UNAI dialogue. But we're hoping that somehow all these reflections will culminate in something great next year, in terms of what needs to like checking and tracking progress around these issues. But obviously, we've made suggestions on how to strengthen the mechanism so that it's much more irrelevant to our context, especially for us in the global south. So yeah, the fact that we are talking about it, we want to see tangible action still. It's given us an place to discuss the issues, but real work is on the ground in our countries, when we then see, for instance, Kenya right now is evaluating their own national AI strategy. There's some call for input. So when you're looking at that, what else can we sort of leverage from the outcome, even from the engagement? Unfortunately, right now, the report is not yet out. So I cannot say this is the outcome from the AI dialogue, but definitely that will be out. And when it's out, we can leverage some of the recommendations, but definitely we can leverage the preliminary report of the independent panel. Maybe if we're making any inputs into the some of the AI strategies that are being developed, like I mentioned, Kenya. I think their call should be lapsing next week or something. So it is something that has started, thinking on the continent, but also bringing together multi-stakeholder approaches to it. Although, like we've had today, there's room to strengthen how those happen.
Thank you so much, Tobekile. So, of course, while there were no resolutions, it's still a plus that, we were able to convene, and it's a great launch pad to really, but of course, it gives us rooms to better coordinate as stakeholders and really coordinating our inputs. And you mentioned something really crucial. It's what's the real work that we're doing locally? Because sometimes or often there's this temptation to want to engage in global processes without having done the foundational or addressing the foundational building blocks at the local level. So thank you so much for sharing that, and thank you so much to our panel. We'll now open up for a round of reflections and questions or concerns from the audience. Please feel free to raise your hand, and then I'll invite you to speak, or simply just type it out and put it in the chat. I see here we have a comment from Kayode that says, on sovereignty, this data extracted by AI reminds us of the scenario of extracting our land resources like gold and crude oil, which is refined in the West and sold back to Africa without Africans being compensated accordingly. So how can Africans benefit financially from their data curated by AI? So that's one of the first questions. But who gets to shape AI governance frameworks globally and in Africa? So I invite everyone to interact with the comment. I see, Prof. Guy, you were typing something, but it seems to have been cut short. But of course, I invite you to raise your hand and let's have a conversation. Any reflections so far? Any questions for our panelists? But even as we reflect on this, I invite everyone to really think about, when we think of governance principles, what is perhaps that one or two key principles that we should be prioritizing as a continent? Yes, Lydia, I see your hand. I'll come to you shortly. Let me just see if we have any other hands from the audience. Prof. Guy, I see your comment got cut. I don't know if you're able to come in and comment on it.
Yeah, thank you, Bulanda. I managed to type it because the first one went too quickly. I was just saying that if we are thinking about the real forces driving this, then it's clear to me that we have to take stock of not only where the technology is coming from, but where the chips are coming from, where the data centers are based, and what the conditionalities are of using these systems, and where the African data goes when we use these systems, and what their biases are and all that. So people have touched on that, but the main thing I wanted to raise is given that you have this American and Chinese corporate contestation now, to what extent is the opportunity for us to make alliances with one or the other, or part here, part there. Given that, you know, I suppose the question of really trying to become agents in this technology and using it for public interest and ensuring African languages, African inclusion, African human rights. I'd be very interested as to how the people foresee this bigger power context and what that means in terms of possibilities and risks, because I don't think we can extract ourselves from that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. Guy. Daniel, you have your hand up.
Thank you so much. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Yeah, my name is Daniel Mulukele. I'm a member of parliament of the Zimbabwean National Assembly, but I'm also here in my other capacity as a member of the African Parliamentary Network on Internet Governance, APNIC. And a few weeks ago, I was also selected as part of the inaugural cohort of the NOMAI Fellowship, which focuses on capacity building for parliamentarians across the countries in the developing world, where we are being trained to build expertise in artificial intelligence governance, policy, and legislation. So when I saw this meeting popping in on my inbox, I got interested and fascinated. I'm not sure whether there is another parliamentarian in this space today, but I really feel that as civil society and academics and researchers, we need to find ways to also engage parliamentarians, because some of the issues we have been discussing here, they actually need the active participation of parliamentarians. You cannot talk about nations from the context of political administration. For example, when you talk about the constitution, you talk about the laws, the policies that govern AI. At the end of that discussion, you will find yourself engaging parliamentarians. So I just wanted to make a sort of a call out to everyone who is in this space, that wherever you have an opportunity, engage the parliamentarians. There are portfolio committees, like in Zimbabwe, we do have a portfolio committee on ICT. But also APNIC, you can search it online, the African Parliamentary Network on Internet Governance. I also shared earlier on when I joined in my contacts. I really would want to be in some of these spaces. It's my first time to be in your space, Bulanda. So I would be very excited in the future to be part of this process, and if there's a mailing list, to be part of it. But also to make sure that I reach out to other parliamentarians and also know my fellows. I know that there are some from other countries like Eswatini and so on. We are resuming the program next week. So once I get to know the other parliamentarians who have been given the opportunity to be part of this fellowship, is for 6 months until December, and we do online lectures and modules so that they are also networked with partners like you. So that's my main message, to say, let's work together, let's engage parliamentarians, and let's take advantage of parliamentarians like me who are passionate about internet governance. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Good to know that we have a policymaker in our midst. Of course, thank you so much for emphasizing that we need to, of course, coordinate and network across different stakeholders. And of course, we are in touch with APNIC, so do expect to hear from us shortly. Of course, this is a series in many of such interventions. So thank you so much for that show of support. And of course, we will be reaching out sometime soon. That said, yes, Kayode, I see you have your hand up. Let's take your comment or question, and then we can get back to the panelists.
Okay, good afternoon or good morning. My name is Kayode Oguntade. Okay, so My first observation here is I think it's no new knowledge that African countries kind of came in late on the technology space and technology conversations because most of the technologies we are using, from Windows to Apple and the rest of them, are coming from outside Africa most times. And I think and obviously, so it's clear that even the AI conversation too, we are more or less catching up on the conversation. I think the starting point would also be for Africans to own their data. When I say own their data, you see that I look at the way a lot of AI models operate, and I see a lot of time that I keep asking myself the question, okay, so where is this coming from? Where is this coming from? Where is this coming from? So we don't really own our data. And when I say own our data, what I mean is some of the servers or many of the servers where this information is domiciled is not even within an African, in quote, data center, so to speak. So that is, I think, a good point for us to own our data. If we own our data, then we can now start moving towards the angle of not just taking credit, but also having that repository being valuable to us in terms of some of these AI models are monetized. So, and so I think the concern of this conversation is also how do we get good benefit for our data. So my own contribution here is that we need to put up technology structures that allows us own our data. We need to have our own data centers. We need to have stronger policies on how we construct and how we churn out information to the rest of the world. So that's the angle I think we look into critically that will help even the policies that are put in place. As long as we don't own our data, the policies can just go so far. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kayode. Indeed, good point of reflection in terms of how do we get a good benefit out of our own data? And of course, you did offer a solution to that, which is that we need to be pushing for more technological structures that enable us to own our own data. And of course, it's, again, bigger conversations around these technological structures like data centers. What are some of the safeguards around data centers, and how do those reflect our local realities in terms of looking at scarcity in water, in electricity, and land? So definitely a good point for reflection. Lastly, Liz, let's hear from you.
Thanks, Bulanda. I was just reflecting on the data sovereignty notes that Daniel and one other person has put on chat. And some months ago, like 2 months ago, we did stakeholder webinars analyzing Africa's national AI strategies. And you saw that data sovereignty was an important part of it. Almost every country was saying that we want our data to be sovereign. The other problem with African data is that it exists so much in silos, so that government agencies don't speak to each other, or they don't have policies by which they speak to each other, because we want that let's say Ministry of Health speaking to another ministry that is very, very important and related work, so that you don't have to give your data all the time, but also there's efficiency in government services and optimizing government service delivery in that case. But there are no policies through which agencies can share data. Also, there's also a culture of secrecy. There, the same challenges that face us with the freedom for access to information. There are other capacity challenges where our data is also not digitized. So a lot of investments need to be done to ensure that African data is also usable. You'll be surprised that in a research that we did, that even stakeholders who have data, plus government agencies who have data, don't even know the value of data that they have, and they don't even know who else it can be useful to. So that mapping would be very important. But the other thing I'd also like to talk about is the mismatch of the strategies themselves what the government says in the UN platforms and what they actually do. There's usually a mismatch where you hear government say, we want sovereignty in our data. We want to protect people from our data going outside. But then again, you see countries also signing deals with countries like US to sell data to other countries without even engaging in institutions like data protection or other human rights institutions. It's usually another government functions that usually does this without the coordination of the entire government. I think we should call this out enough. A number of African countries, case example, the US health deal, where some African countries were supposed to give access to health data directly from hospitals, actually, to American companies, and in exchange, they would get certain funds to support health. I think only a number of countries, the cases were taken to the judiciary and they were able to be suspended because they actually didn't follow the domestic laws. And the Kenyan one is actually going on, but it's been forced. The court has directed that it actually follows the right processes. So I think the work here is for us to also be vigilant and to put our governments accountable so that with the data use and whatever international cooperation that we are entering through, they follow human rights standards, international human rights standards. So there should be a responsibility there, and they should also follow domestic laws other than overruling it. That's also an accountability element to our own governments, where they say one thing and then they implement something else. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Liz, for those reflections, especially on the fragmentation in data management and governance practices. And I definitely agree that there's still a lot of work to be done in how we match policy and practices, and of course, how we hold our governments accountable on that. So thank you so much for sharing those reflections. I'll now turn back to our panelists. I know, Lydia, you had your hand up, but if we could reflect on Prof. Guy's comment, especially on, let me just see if I can find it. Yeah, really, taking stock of where this technology is coming from and looking at the power asymmetries. How do we address the possibilities and these risks? Do we envision that perhaps having some of these countries as key allies would work, but also how does that mature into like a meaningful partnership, right? Looking at the already existing power asymmetries. So I would invite Lydia. I know you had your hand up, and then we can have another panelist comment on the power asymmetries that we see. Thank you.
Linda. Sorry, I lost you for a second there. I just got to the end when you said something about power symmetries.
Okay, I know you had a comment earlier, you had your hand up, so I thought we could take that. Or was it a direct response to some of the questions?
Yeah, it was just a response to the question from Kayode pertaining to sovereignty.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yes. So on I think there was a couple of questions there. So data extracted by AI and us being able to gain value out of it. This is one of the things that we think a lot about at Masakane. How do we build AI not only for the temporary hype, but as a self-sustaining system that can create value for Africans? And the only way for us to be able to ensure that is through commercialization in our own African context, because ultimately the greatest incentive for growth will be commercial gain. And so one of the things that we do is we engage extensively African startups and technology groups about the ways in which they can do fair trade integration of the models and the data sets that are currently existing within our body of work in ways that they're able to create apps that serve Africans better, create software solutions that serve Africans better, that are in fact built in Africa and create value. And so by them being able to create that value, it becomes a self-sustaining cycle. We help them to engage with community and be able to create these data sets and these models that they then integrate. They're able to sell that as a product in the marketplace that has value for Africans. That value then comes back. And when you're able to establish that cyclical nature, we then get to a point where we no longer require external funding or external resourcing for the work that we're doing. But instead, we now have value that then spreads to other areas of applicability. If you think about agriculture, if you think about education, the more of this integration that we have, the more we're able to prove that, hey, we can build this in-house as in on the continent, and it can still have value for us. We then become more confident and aware of the digital value that we inherently have. And when we become more aware, we're able to guard that better. So I think ultimately it's a game of incentives, and we should actively breed those incentives and those ideas of data sovereignty is not just about pride, but it's genuinely about value. It can create value for us. So that's the answer on the first question that you put. And then who gets to shape AI governance frameworks globally and in Africa? So I think that they're both the one and in the same. AI is having a global impact. But for us to be able to have that seat effectively at the table and speak for Africa, not just as people who are in the room to listen, but are in the room to speak about the scene as it exists on the continent, we need to also be builders. We need to be innovators. We need to be part of the change that is coming. And that's why I feel very passionately about the fact that in Africa, we are thinking about AI differently. Often when people talk about Africa, they say we're playing catch up. I would say we have a unique advantage with AI because we can see how they've done it badly there. And we can think about the ways in which we can do it more efficiently for our context. Specifically, when we think about resource efficiency, when we think about conflict between the entities like the Amazons and the creators of these data warehouses and how that brings issues to communities and societies, we are able to learn from that proactively, and you can start to think about better ways in which you can architect AI that is truly reflective of Africa. So I would say this is an opportunity for Africa to do things differently and to set the pace, because others were quick to the race and perhaps made very hasty decisions, but we're in a position to make better decisions for our context and set the standard for how to get AI right the first time. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Lydia. Definitely a lot to reflect upon in how we ensure that we're reflecting African realities in AI development and governance. I'm being mindful that we are almost coming to time. Elizabeth, would you speak to the question on the power asymmetries and how do we ensure that we're balancing some of these possibilities and risks?
It's not the easiest question to answer, I suppose, but reflecting on it, I think yes, I suppose, and we should be strategically thinking like that. But we have to move, I think, carefully, maybe with some sort of alliances, so we don't end up being the market where the rivalry plays out. I think yes, because and we have the opportunity to do that, and coming with strong bargaining power, and also maybe just really understanding what is really ultimately driving both these powers. And so then being able to understand how to approach and how to navigate it. Again, otherwise we can end up replacing one with the other, or just being a market where we're just being tossed from side to side. How I couldn't immediately say. I think it is something to think about. It is something that I've been thinking about, but it does need a little bit of, I think, alliances. And I say that bargaining power, sort of confidently stepping forward to negotiate better. It comes down to what is the ultimate objective of some of the parties we have or players we have negotiating on our behalf. So that's one thing. But I wanted quickly to say something there was a question about data and owning data. And I sense the frustration of, we do need to look at building these data centers here. And, otherwise, what's the point of policy? So I just wanted to just underscore that as frustratingly slow as it can be, like with policy, that's where we need it. I'm going to take Lydia's point where she says, to think about on the continent, we think about Africa differently. We don't want to just duplicate the building of data centers so that we can own our data. Who owns data in this world right now? When I think about it, even in the West, who owns data? It's a very small percentage. They're also struggling with it. They own it better because they own the data centers. I understand that. Could we do it better? Could we build it and do it better so that this data that we own is not also owned by just 1%, 0.1%? I think that's the challenge that I'd put forward, and that's where policy and some sort of thinking comes into mind to shape that in a more reflective, purposeful way.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for really underscoring that we need to move with caution. So there's room for alliances, but we need to move with caution. And of course, it ties into the point that an earlier speaker mentioned that, that we need to be very mindful and interrogating at every stage in terms of how do we get local value for some of these AI developments. Because before we know it, we'll be competing amongst ourselves as to who or which country has the most data centers in Africa, and yet those may not even be serving any purpose. So before we come to a close, any last reflections?
Thank you. What I would say is, as we consider the differentiated and disproportionate harms that we can experience with AI deployment, I think it's important to shy away, at least from my desk, from specifically perhaps making that whole being drawn into the debate around China versus US, but sort of like stepping back to center international human rights law at the fore to say, can we have basic norms that we say if we're procuring from whoever it is we're procuring, these are the basic norms that we need to tackle. And once we do that, we'll be able to ensure that across the different sectors where AI is being deployed, we are able to sort of, call for the bare minimum, and where we need to draw lines. Now we're discussing AI red lines in specific sectors and areas. We come up with things that we know and we're saying for a fact, these are non-negotiable asks for human rights to thrive. So whoever is selling a product, be it a Chinese company, a US-based company, they all must conform to basic guidelines. And this is better steeped in international law. Obviously, from that whole sort of methodology, you'll see that there are other governments who are more in line to respect human rights than others. That's where then you find that you begin to sort of seemingly align with a specific direction. But ultimately, the yardstick is international human rights law, I would say. But very interesting question, Prof, there as we close on this.
Thank you so much, Tobekile, and a great way to close, right? In that we need to center human rights law, looking at the various norms and standards so that, we're able to really center what are the non-negotiables, regardless of the country that we are dealing with. So thank you so much for those reflections. And of course, the conversation continues. Like I said, from our end as Digital Action, this is but the first of many conversations in a series, really, And of course, for those that would be at FIFA, so the Forum on Internet Freedom in Africa, we are hosting a Day Zero event where we are bringing together policymakers and civil society to continue to reflect on how can we ensure that AI governance and development reflects our local realities as Africa. So really still a conversation that is ongoing. If you'll be at FIFA, please do reach out and let's see how we can connect. But that said, it's really just for myself and Digital Action, a huge thank you. First of all, to our speakers, thank you for all the insights and for really an engaging conversation. A lot has come out of this conversation, lots of learning points for myself as well. But also, huge thank you to everyone that attended and participated today. Thank you so much for your engagement in the chat section, and do reach out to us should anything come up. We're always happy to collaborate and, of course, carry on the discussion. So it's a huge thank you from my team and I wish everyone a good day. And of course, as you drop off the call, remember to subscribe to our newsletter. It's at digitalaction.co.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you so
Appreciate
much.
the invitation.
Thanks so much. Bye, everyone.